As a Christian, I've always been somewhat conflicted by the moral implications of war. I willingly served in Vietnam because I believed that it was a just cause to protect innocent lives from communism. War is always ugly and sometimes must be fought for the greater good. Determining the greater good requires serious reflection. There is no better place to start than St. Thomas Aquinas' thoughts on jus ad bellum, or the just war. The first criterion of a just war, as proffered by St. Thomas, is to protect innocent lives, to restore rights wrongfully denied, or to reestablish just order. The second criterion is proportionality, a reasonable expectation that the outcome will entail enough good to outweigh the inevitable pain and destruction of war. The third criterion is right intention, the aim to create a much better, more just subsequent peace that there would have been if war had not ever been waged. Other aspects to be considered include right authority, such as a sovereign state. In the case of Ukraine, I've weighed the following. History plays a key role in the Ukrainian war. Before the wall between Eastern and Western Europe came down in 1991, NATO, a defensive treaty with around 16 countries, faced the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. When the wall came down, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact disappeared. Russia is no longer a communist country, and Christianity is now encouraged and supported in Russia. Since that time, NATO has expanded to 30 countries, while Russia has made no move aggressively against Western Europe. In fact, US NATO have attempted to encircle and thus de facto threaten Russia. The US orchestrated the 2014 coup in Ukraine to establish a pro-Western government. The US was also behind the conflict in Georgia. The US interfered in the elections in Hungary and Belarus. Since 2015, the US, EU, and NATO have been financing, supporting, equipping, arming, and training the Ukrainian army. Since 2015, the Ukrainian government signed the Minsk Accords 1 and 2, agreeing to consider limited autonomy of the local majority ethnic Russian oblast in eastern Ukraine. France, Britain, and Germany have all now publicly stated that they never intended to honor that agreement, and that it was to buy time for Ukraine to build up their military forces with their assistance. Since 2007, Putin publicly warned the US, EU, and NATO that incorporating countries abutting their borders was a threat to Russia. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, opposing political parties have been abolished, the government controls the media, churches have been closed, Russian language has been banned, and Ukraine conducted military operations against ethnic Russian Ukrainians, resulting in 14,000 deaths before the Russians ever entered Ukraine. It has to be noted that the ethnic Russian population in eastern and southern Ukraine is nearly 70 to 90%. Then there are the 46 biolabs in Ukraine that have connections to the U.S. through DARPA, National Institute of Health, Center for Disease Control, Big Pharma, and the Biden family, all knee-deep in mRNA testing and other unknown research. one can or could reasonably deduce that the human testing at these labs would have never been legally permitted on U.S. soil. I have concluded now that the U.S., EU, NATO have precipitated, orchestrated, and goaded Russia into this conflict. It certainly has not been to defend democracy and freedom or protect human life, innocent life. From the Russian perspective, they could justify their incursion based on their effort to protect innocent lives and restore wrongfully denied rights to ethnic Russians in eastern and southern Ukraine. Russia initially went into Ukraine with an estimated 200,000 troops, as opposed to 600,000 Ukrainians, armed, trained, and advised by the U.S. and NATO. One can assume that their intent was limited to protect the oppressed ethnic Russians in those areas and to force Ukraine into peace negotiations. In March 2022, peace talks did take place between Russia and Ukraine in Turkey. The U.S., with the assistance of Britain's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, torpedoed those talks. Then in September, Biden bombed the Nord Stream pipelines, putting Western Europe lives at risk, an act of war not only against Russia, but also Western Europe, our allies, who owned 49% of the line. If I were Russian, I would consider U.S., EU, NATO efforts an existential threat to the country. Yet, U.S., EU, NATO ignored Russian concerns and continued to arm Ukraine and watch the senseless loss of life and the destruction of the country. There has never been, nor is there, a serious attempt by the U.S., EU, NATO to negotiate with Russia and end the violence. The U.S., EU, NATO have de facto declared war on Russia. It is not a war to protect the innocent. There is no greater good to be had from this war unless it is a dissolution of NATO and EU and the humbling of the United States of America. It is a war to bend Russia to their will by any means necessary. It is not a jus ad bellum, a just war. There is no consideration of proportionality. There is no right intention. Hundreds of thousands have been killed and wounded. Millions have been displaced. This is an unholy war being waged by the U.S., EU, and NATO. This war is about morality. It is about good versus evil. It is not of God. This war constitutes a serious and legitimate religious concern, necessitating a moral response from God's children. Religious leaders of all denominations and justice-minded citizens must make themselves heard loud and clear. This is a war that should never have been fought and must be ended now. Justice-minded citizens must act and pray that God will change the hearts of our national leaders before even more innocent life is squandered.